In Isaiah 55, the Lord declares, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." If Nonato Silva had had his way, he never would have been a preacher. Nonato was born in 1965 in rural Brazil, the youngest of 13 children. Nonato was raised in the small city of Nova Olinda, where missionaries Jim and Mary Moreland led him to Christ, baptizing him in a Brazilian river at age 10. "I understood that in baptism, Jesus would wash away my sins," he recalls, "so I literally looked at the waters in the river, trying to see my sins floating downstream." Meanwhile, more than 4,000 miles away, Tanya Davis was born in Webb City, Missouri. Tanya's parents had met Jim Moreland during their time at Ozark, and they decided to go to Brazil as missionaries as well. So in 1975, young Tanya and her family landed in a new country to learn a new language, and in the years ahead, as Tanya watched her family plant and lead churches in Brazil, she felt a strong call to become a missionary herself. Tanya grew up helping her parents in church, putting on plays, leading worship and choir, and directing vacation Bible school. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Brazil, Nonato spent his teenage years living with Jim Moreland's family, building a strong friendship. And when he finished high school, this sharp young man worked as the Secretary of Education for his home city of Nova Olinda, and his leadership was quickly apparent. Nonato was responsible for 23 schools and oversaw 80 employees, even as a young man. And sensing his own leadership abilities, he decided he would become a politician. But the Lord's ways are higher than ours, and God had other plans for Nonato. Jim Moreland had decided that Nonato needed to go into ministry, so he talked to his wife Mary about sending Nonato to study at Ozark. Mary answered, "Let's pray about it." Jim said, "You pray. I will go to Nova Olinda and talk to Nonato." And after 2 weeks, Nonato finally told Jim, "Okay, I'll go to Ozark on one condition, that I don't have to be a preacher when I come back." I'm sure the Lord smiled, and Nonato enrolled at Ozark in 1986. Those first years at Ozark for Nonato were hard. He battled homesickness, writing nearly 200 letters to family and friends. He battled cultural changes. For the first month, he ate only sandwiches because the food was so different. And of course, there was the language barrier. "I understood only about 40% of what my teachers said," remembers Nonato. "I spent more time looking up words in the dictionary than reading the assignments. I recorded every class and listened to the tapes again later, so I studied from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. After just 2 weeks of school, I wanted to go back to Brazil." Nonato was sure this was not the place for him. But the Lord's ways are higher than ours, and the Lord had a message for the discouraged young Brazilian. It was about that time, remembers Nonato, that Drew Ashwell gave a dorm devotion from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. "Not that we are adequate in ourselves, but our adequacy is from God." That verse was a message from God to me. I went back to my room and repeated, "My adequacy is from God." That night, Nonato posted that verse above his desk, and he says, "It has become my prayer and confidence from that day on, and my years at Ozark ended up some of the best years of my life." Looking back, Nonato says, "My time at OCC did a lot of good for me, but mainly it prepared me to accept God's call on my life. Even though I said I didn't want to be a preacher, that's exactly what God had in store for me." Meanwhile, Tanya's family permanently returned to the States from Brazil, and though she and Nonato had met once years earlier back in Brazil at Jim Moreland's house when Nonato was 15 and Tanya was just 9 years old, it looked like their paths might never cross again. But the Lord has His ways. In the fall of 1989, Nonato was entering his senior year, soon to leave Ozark, when guess who walked in Ozark's door as a freshman? It was Tanya, the only other Portuguese speaker on campus. After Tanya graduated from both Missouri Southern and Ozark, Nonato and Tanya were married. And today, the Silvas have 3 children. Their oldest son, Talis, is 25, their daughter Naja is 22, and their youngest son, Ian, is 17. And they have all spent their lives serving the Lord in Nonato's home country. "God sent me back to Brazil," says Nonato, and that boy, who didn't want to be a preacher, embraced life in the pulpit. In his first 5 years at the church in Araguaína, Brazil, the church grew from 50 to 185. Nonato preaching, Tanya serving in the children's and worship ministries. Nonato led them through a building program that tripled the size of their worship area, and Nonato imagined that he would spend the rest of his ministry focused on this one church. But the Lord's ways? Over the last 34 years, the church in Araguaína hasn't been the only one Nonato helped grow. Now, Nonato is only about 5 feet 4 inches tall, but like the Apostle Paul, who was also short, Nonato has cast a long shadow far beyond just one congregation. His church planted 2 others in their city, and then he began and led a conference, like the North American Christian Convention, for the churches of northern Brazil, and this annual gathering will soon celebrate its 25th year. Nonato has preached in most of the 18 northern states in Brazil, and he has helped raise up a whole generation of preachers and teachers and leaders for those congregations. His influence is felt throughout the entire region. He often travels for hours to meet with a preacher or with a congregation to help them through transitions or challenges or times of growth, and Nonato gives them a listening ear, sound advice, organizational guidance, personal encouragement, and the churches throughout the nation are stronger for it. But Nonato still loves preaching each week in that same church in Araguaína. One of my joys after 3 decades with the same church, says Nonato, is to hear kids today say, "My grandma took me to this church. My parents taught me about Jesus. My family serves the Lord, and I'm a Christian because of this church." I thank God for Ozark, says Nonato, and for using my experience here to bless His kingdom in Brazil. I can still say my adequacy is from God. On behalf of Ozark Christian College, thank you, Nonato and Tanya Silva. Thank you for allowing the Lord to have His way with you, and thank you for strengthening the churches for the glory of God and for the good of Brazil. Well done, good and faithful servants.